All right. Hello, everyone. I am joined today by Kevin Tallaksen. He's with Permeate Evangelism Ministries, and he has been doing a lot of videos recently on the problem of evil, the problem of suffering. So I decided to have him on so that we can talk about this extremely touchy and difficult subject. So maybe to start off the conversation, you can give us a little introduction, Kevin. Tell the people about
Yeah,
yourself.
sure. Yeah, my name's Kevin Tallaksen. I lead an organization, Permeate Evangelism, which helps create a culture of evangelism within churches, getting them outside the four walls, if you will, sharing the gospel in everyday life through trainings and going and doing it, social media content and things like that. And we're excited, Josh and others, to be part of the team as well. My wife and I live out in Pennsylvania, and we travel a pretty lot doing different ministry things. And as we go and do evangelism, this is one of the most frequently asked questions about why does God allow suffering. So it's so important to be able to answer it, but also in a truthful and loving manner. And so I'm excited for this conversation.
Absolutely. So maybe what you can do first is kind of lay out what the problem is in the first place. Why is suffering, why is evil even a problem in the Christian worldview?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that suffering and evil, every single person has an experience with it. So it's not like, oh, some people have an experience with suffering and some don't. There's different levels, but we all have experienced suffering and evil and the results of it as well. So it's a shared experience in some ways. And the real issue of problem of suffering and evil is it's a few issues, but one is where's the origin, which I'm sure we'll talk about that earlier. Is a lot of people say, well, the origin must be God since he created the world and beings and things like that. And so the origin of suffering, but also even after the origin of why is God not doing something about suffering and evil in our present day or even in the past as well. And so it's not only the origin, but why is God not responding how we see would be most helpful. And so I would say that's the two biggest issues that we can tackle in a lot of things as well. But it's so important to tackle it because people at some level have left the faith because of this problem of suffering. And so it's super important for those that have left, but also those that are considering the faith as well. It is important that we give a truthful answer because every religion gives an answer to the problem of evil and suffering. And I would argue that the Christian answer is the most full and most reasonable, even. And it's very different than all the other religions as well. So we can cover that too. But I think those are some initial thoughts. And if you have anything to add too, Josh, on the initial problem.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that I struggled with in many, many ways, and I've thought about it very deeply for a very long time, wrestled with it for years. And I've talked to Christians before who don't see it as a big deal. They think that it has an easy answer. And I am just thinking in my head, I'm like, oh, either you're not familiar with how bad things have been in the world or are currently today. Either you're not thinking about that clearly enough, or you're just like not thinking about the problem at all. I feel like if you just like ignore
Mhm.
it, yeah, sure, it's not a big deal. But you can't just walk up to someone and say like, "Oh, evil exists, but you just have to have faith in God." And that doesn't work for
Yeah.
everyone, right? Especially people who don't believe in God. So it is a
Yeah.
much bigger problem than I think people give it credit, and I think that Christians need to work through it a little bit more.
Yeah, I totally agree. And even there's a lot of answers that we could give scripturally, like some verses and things like that, that people think are zingers, like, oh, we'll just get them with this one. And it's like suffering builds character, but that really doesn't answer the question at all. There's truth to it, but we have to be cognizant of understanding the person's perspective of that. That really doesn't help her understand. And so when we train people, we don't tell them just say this and you'll be okay, but it's working through the depths of it is so critical. And no one that I have met has ever been convinced in one conversation. It's over time that as they dig through all of the information and different views, that's where they come to different conclusions, and it's helpful. But if we think we're going to convince people in one sit down conversation, then we're definitely misled.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that every single person deals with this problem and has problems with certain aspects of it that other people may not. Like, for me personally, I don't have a huge issue with God, with storms and earthquakes and disease.
Mhm.
I don't have a huge issue with God doing those types of things because God gives and takes life. But what I do have a problem with is God not stepping in and preventing humans from doing evil against other humans. That's always been the crux of the argument for me. I use the example of if I saw someone being like assaulted and murdered, right? I would step in and prevent it. And if I would, why
Mhm.
wouldn't God? Then that's kind of
Mhm.
what always bothered me. The diseases, the earthquakes and stuff. We live in a fallen world that's pretty easily explained away in, biblical texts. But yeah, it's the preventing of
Yeah.
human evil that's always been my issue.
Yeah, and that's a good point of like each person has a different aspect of suffering that they struggle with. And for me, maybe if I could share real quick my journey, like I was brought up into a Christian home, and in 4th grade I got type 1 diabetes, not the one that you eat a lot of candy and you get sick. It's the genetic one. And it made me question a lot of like, how could God allow it? I've been to Sunday school every single week. Like I've done every Christian thing I possibly could, and looking back, it really made me spiral, and even getting into pornography and in high school drinking and drugs. And a lot of it was anger at God. And then I got a lot of sports injuries because that was like my coping mechanism of life, if you will. And so for me, suffering on the personal side was really how I like was struggling to get through. Um, and it took me a while, and it's not a story of where, oh, I just was understood how suffering worked and then I got saved. But I got saved and I saw that Jesus loved me despite of who I was. And at age 18, God radically changed my life from a life of partying to following Jesus. And a month after, because I was mentored by an evangelist, I was starting to share the gospel. But I was still struggling with this idea of why did God allow this to happen to me? And not only me, but like I see all the other diseases and suffering generally. And it really never resolved where like, oh, one day it clicked. But the more I knew God and the more I walked with God, I saw that his nature, his character wasn't, oh, I'm gonna stick it to Kevin to get diabetes because I'm gonna make him suffer like this sadistic entity. Um, and by God's grace, he used actually my diabetes in a lot of ways of just producing the character, as I mentioned, but even this longing for something more from this life. And even just one quick story too that helped me cope and understand these things. There was a Chinese student I was sharing the gospel with. He had never heard about Jesus, and he uh shared with me, he's like, Kevin, because you've been open with your diabetes and your questioning of why does God allow suffering, like I have to share with you something. And so he shared this, how he had lung cancer. He hasn't shared with anyone before, but he felt open because to share with me because I was struggling with a disease that I was frustrated at God at too. And so it was just a beautiful moment. He ended up coming to Christ, being saved. He ended up dying 6 months later. But just looking at that and like, again, God's sovereignty in it. One, he didn't do it in a sadistic way to make me suffer. There is a promise of restoration, which we'll go into later. But like, he also used it to share the gospel, to bring others to him. And so I don't know the exact reason why I got diabetes and others get cancer. I never have gotten the answer. But the more I got to know God, that's when I trusted him, even in the gray area, even
Mm.
in the unknown. And I saw, because a lot of people don't see that like fruit of, wow, this allowed me to bless another person. So it's not like that's going to happen to all people, but it definitely helped me to grasp that God has a bigger plan than I think that he does. So that's a
Mhm.
little bit just of my journey. I could go into more details, but it's a little bit of that.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important for Christians, like you said, to kind of admit that there is no like perfectly satisfactory answer that's just a slam dunk to the problem of evil. Like we have a
Mhm.
lot of different arguments, a lot of different paths that you can take in answering this problem, but to have just like one thing that slam dunks it's just not there. And I don't think that God allows that answer. Like you read the Bible and there's no clear answer in the Bible for why evil exists in the first
Yeah.
place. God doesn't give us that answer. And there is an element of him just saying, like, look, I'm your Father in heaven. You have to trust me. Uh,
Mhm.
just because, I'm saying it, you don't have to have all the answers. And honestly, I think that even if he did give us the answer, we couldn't comprehend it anyway. But that's my own
Yeah.
personal take on that. But it is important, I think, for Christians when having these conversations with people to be like, look, we don't have all the answers to this. We don't. There is an element of faith, and that's what the Bible commends as righteousness. So, yeah.
Yeah. And what about you? Like you mentioned of like the evil, what would you say drove that part of suffering that you were questioning? Was there a experience in life or an event? What kind of drove that aspect that you were concerned and questioning about?
Yeah, so my first experience with like a great evil in my life was a friend in high school who got brain cancer and died from it, like a brain tumor.
Mm.
And that was like my first like shaking moment of being like, if God is so loving, how could he allow something like this, some suffering to happen to this person?
Yeah.
And it just felt very wrong, right? Why would God allow for cancer to even exist, right? It just doesn't seem right. And kind of that's what the problem of evil does. It attacks one of the three main attributes of God, which is that God is either all good, all knowing, and all good, right? All good, all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, right? So I guess it's like three or four, whatever. And this one always attacked like the is God all loving, right? And I came up with all of my theories. I thought that maybe God is just lying to us and that he is all powerful and all knowing, but he's not all good. He's lying to us. He must be evil in some way that he could allow this. And that was a big struggle for me. I called it my evil God theory, but I thought that I came up with that because I'm an idiot, but that had already existed for a long time. But that was kind of my first experience with it. And then reading history books and seeing the insane amounts of evil that have happened in the world, it's just hard to reconcile with the Christian view of God. I've seen lots of evil in my own life. I've done a lot of traveling. I've seen oppression. I've seen disease. I've seen it all, right? And leprosies. Like I've seen literally like tons of evil, and it is hard in some ways to reconcile with God. But for myself, in my own heart, I think that I have come to at least peace with the topic. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, like you peace with the topic, but it's almost peace with God without the answer
Right. Yeah.
because we don't have the exact why, but it doesn't mean we can't answer it for people because there are some Christians that will say to this topic of, yeah, we don't really know, and then just basically move on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's also a disservice too. So it's this balance, but really it comes back to pointing to the character of God.
Yeah. Yeah. It
But
basically is like just because we don't have the answer to every specific instance of evil, it doesn't mean that there isn't an answer. We just don't know what it is. That's it. Yeah. All these we have all of the character of God in the Bible. We see how God is, and we can see that he is good and he is loving, but he doesn't give us an answer to every question. Yeah.
yeah, and also specifics, like because
Yeah.
the answer to maybe like one person's disease situation or poverty situation is different than the hurricane that came and knocks all these things out. And so there's not a one answer fits all situation as well. So
Yeah, definitely.
do you think, what would you say, like, are the things that we know about suffering, like and things that we can answer about the question that we know for certain? Because I think there's definitely some gray areas which we can go into, but why don't we start with that of like, what do we know in regards to this answer of why does God allow suffering?
I think that the first thing that we kind of have to look at is like the source of the suffering, which is the fall of
Yeah.
man. Okay, so we know that God created the world, it was good, there was no death, there was no pain. And it seems to be that, whatever happened in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, whatever that is, it cursed mankind to now suffer. That even our labor is suffering. Like literally everything is cursed by that one sin that we committed. And that's kind of like the origin, if you want to call it. And that doesn't answer why God would allow Satan to do that and all that, but at least we know where it came from in the earth.
Yeah.
And
And that's so important to start with that, because so many people attack that why does God allow suffering? They change it to why did God create suffering? But
right,
that's false.
right. Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize that evil itself is not like a thing that can be created. Like, I think that's very crucial. God didn't create evil. That's not like a possibility. Evil is an absence of God. God is light. Anything that is not of God is darkness, right? So that's kind of an important aspect that we kind of have to touch on as well. But apart from knowing where evil comes from here in the book of Genesis, right, we know also the end. What is the end
Mhm.
of everything? And it is that the sin, the fracturing of humanity from God, the suffering, it all goes away when God recreates the new heaven and the new earth. All of the suffering and the turmoil and all of that, that is all ended. Every tear will be wiped away. So we know the beginning and the end, and we're kind of living in the middle now and trying to figure out how this is all going to work out.
Yeah, it's true, and I think that beginning and the end piece is so important. And but I would say what and to be a little bit of the devil's advocate, how would that separate from other religions' perspective? Because some of the others claim to have known the origin and the end. What would you say makes Christianity different in that perspective?
I guess I would ask, like, what do you mean by that? Because, like, you have, like, Gnostics, for example, who say that, you know, all evil is caused by the demiurge, right? So God is not all powerful. There's this other God, this evil God, usually the God of the Old Testament, and that's the demiurge, and he's the cause of all the evil in the world. But we have the good God, which is Jesus, who fixes all of it. So, I mean, I guess I'm kind of confused what you mean by the question.
Yeah. So, like, for example, like even some of the world religions, for example,
Mm,
like they do believe in a paradise or like nirvana, if you will. And so there's this future hope that things will get better in the end.
mhm,
And they also agree, like even in the Muslim perspective, that that Allah did not create evil. Like they would say the same thing, is that like humans caused evil and suffering. But what stands with those two things, some of these other religions agree with. How would you respond is like the difference from the Christian perspective, even if those two things are similar?
mm. I think that the primary difference, and I say this about pretty much all religions in every argument, is that the main difference in Christianity is that God is not totally separate from us in the same way that he is in Islam, for example. The
Mhm.
concept of Jesus Christ coming into the world, God's coming into the world, that aspect alone is unimaginable to a Muslim, for example, that God would enter into his creation and become a man and suffer and die. Like all of those things are just unimaginable. So I would say that that's probably the main thing. And that is usually the route that I go with explaining the problem of evil is God is not absent from us. He is not away just kind of letting it all play out. He entered into the creation. He came to suffer. I say that Jesus came to suffer to answer the problem of suffering. Like he suffered to fix the
Mhm.
problem, because
Yeah.
how else is it going to get fixed, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. And I feel like most of the other world religions that have this similar idea that God did not cause evil and there's a future hope, is their hope is more wishful thinking, in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
there is no evidence that things will actually get better.
Mm-hmm.
But within Christianity, we have Jesus who came and suffered with us, which, just to pause there, that is like so different than any other religion, because no other religion has God come down, as
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned too, like, and that he suffered with us. And that just shows, even as we respond to people, the empathy that we can and should have. And more importantly than our empathy, but God empathized with them because he did all these, he suffered as we did. And so I think it's so important in the midst of suffering is we can bring it back to the gospel, to Jesus, because that's the hope that we can be more firm on, because he actually came and showed himself. It's not just written in a book and wishful thinking. He actually did it. And I believe in like the penal substitutionary atonement. I believe in that. But there's also like the Christ is victor, that like he has declared victory, and Colossians 2:15 goes into that. But another way to look at this too, Isaiah 53:5, I believe it says, talks about by his wounds we are healed. And then First Peter 2:24, it says this. It says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. And I'm not the name it, claim it, everyone can get healed now because Jesus died and rose. But there is an aspect of, we are healed in relationship between God and man, but there is this healing that has happened and is coming. And I believe it will be full and holistic in nature as we are restored in Christ in the future. And so to talk about this future hope of like there won't be any suffering, it goes right to Jesus, right to his work on the cross and his resurrection, that we are healed through that. In whatever that looks like, people have different interpretations, but that's important that we highlight the work of Jesus and the results of that.
Yeah, and I think that there's like this whole element of, how do we overcome evil biblically? Like what is the answer? How do we overcome it? And we overcome evil, we conquer evil with good, right? By repaying good for evil. That I think that's just so important, because when it talks about like God is love, and we have all of this evil in the world, well, he's overcoming it by allowing the suffering, because this is ultimately what love is. It's allowing people to hurt you, to do things that offend you, that say things that are terrible, and still loving them anyway. Like that's how you overcome the evil in the world. And I think that this is kind of like this weird, almost like arbitrary, there's no scientific proof of this or something, but in a sense it's like it's the story of the Bible is overcoming the evil with good. Like you see, like heaping hot coals on people, when someone curses you, don't curse them back, bless them in return. It's like all of this is just like there's evil in the world, but we as people who are indwelt by God himself, we're supposed to do what Christ did in overcoming the evil with good. And it's hard, and nobody wants to do it because it's suffering, but there seems to be a very strong correlation in the Bible between how much you suffer and how much glory you will see in heaven. So you can't ignore that either.
Yeah, and it's so helpful to look at the macro story of the Bible, because so often we can get caught up in the like just reading chronologically, and that's good. But it's taking a step back and seeing it totally. I mean, the suffering is one of the main aspects of the story of the Bible. The main character is God, and humans are in there too, but like suffering is the common thread almost in every book and every character. And so the Bible has a lot to say with it. And I agree with you, the good overcoming of the evil, because it's so easy to get to the point where like we see suffering and we're like, we want to create vengeance. And God very clearly says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And that takes a leap of faith, because we have to trust God that his vengeance is better than my vengeance. And this is not talking about like justice, because we do need to, there is justice that needs to take in this world, but it's so difficult. But it really comes down to a question: do you trust God and his nature and his character? And that's hard. And that's why this question's so hard, because you can't convince people of trusting God, but you can lead them to God and say, you introduce them and say, you lead them to water, they got a drink of it, if you will. So
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, you look at, because my problem has always been the evil from one man to another. And you think like, how do you end the cycle of evil? Because let's say like someone punches my son. Well, I just feel like immediate, like I'm going to inflict evil on that person, right? That's my immediate thought, and probably rightly so. I think I'd be completely justified in that. But it's like to end the cycle of evil would be to forgive, right? To end the cycle of violence would be to forgive. I think it was Gandhi. Like, I hate to quote Gandhi because I don't really like him, but he says like an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and it's like it's true. Like, it is true that the only way to end a cycle is to forgive, is to allow
Yeah.
someone to offend you and to forgive them anyway. That's the
Yeah.
only way. Yeah.
It's so true. And I don't want to, we can have this for another conversation, but Ephesians 4, it says, don't let the sun go down on your anger, giving a foothold to the devil. And
Mhm.
there is so much suffering in the world, and there is a righteous anger that we need to, like, if someone defenseless is getting hurt, like we should be angry or something's wrong with us. But there's also an anger that is unrighteous, and also specifically an anger at God that is very relevant in today's world, and it also breeds into the spiritual realm not good things. And so this idea of forgiveness in the midst of this conversation of suffering is so important. And even talking to people and discipling people, they're angry at God for an event. My kid got this disease, or how'd they let this person get murdered, or whatever it might be. There's a genuine anger at God, which I don't blame them for necessarily, because it's really hard. But if they don't work through it, there's definitely a lot of negative results from that as well. That, as you answer this question, being aware of the importance of forgiveness, and even like not blaming God, which again doesn't happen overnight, but it's an important topic in the midst of this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe we can get into an example in the Bible of God doing something that people perceive to be evil, and
Yeah.
then kind of going from there. I did a video recently on this topic, the problem of evil, and I briefly mentioned the Amalekites. The Amalekite genocide, essentially, is what it is. And people have a huge issue with that, but I
Yeah.
mean, I don't have any issue with this one. I don't think I ever have, because once you know who the Amalekites are, you kind of soften up on God on this one. But let's talk about it. Why would God, who is all loving, that's what everyone says, God is all love, and it's like they just leave it at that, they forget all the other attributes. Why would a God
Yeah.
who's all loving command the genociding of not just the men, but it says the women, the children, the animals, all of them? Why would God do that?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I've definitely heard that before. So I, even before going into who the Amalekites are, like, I always start with who is God, because like you
Mhm.
said, how could a God who's loving? Because if you try to explain a loving God doing that, I don't think you can
Mhm.
explain it. But if you can explain a God that is loving but also just in the same breath, in the same sentence, he's never not either of those attributes. He's always love. He's always just. That helps people like prepare themselves before we go into the answer that they may not like, is because they're misdefining God. And so if you're misdefining something and we're on separate pages that God is love and just, and he just thinks that he's love, you're never going to meet. So it's almost,
Mhm.
you got to set the foundation. So God is perfectly just and holy and perfect, but he's also loving and forgiving. But then, as you mentioned, you got to look at the Amalekites. I mean, I don't know, remember off the top of my head all the evils, but they were like eating people, cannibals, sacrificing babies. They're extraordinarily violent. And this wasn't just for a year or two, like war happened. Like, this was over generations after generations, and false gods, all these things. And there was opportunities for them to come to the God of Israel, and whether they thought it or not, but they had an opportunity. They saw the work of God in out of Egypt. All the stories got there. They had the opportunity, like Rahab did, to come to the other side, and God would have had mercy. And so this idea of they never had an opportunity, to me, is false. They had an opportunity. Romans 1, it says no man is without excuse. And then the commanding of genocides. Yeah, that's hard. Not only the man, but the women and children. But again, they had opportunities. I don't fully understand even the child one. I'm not going to try to explain that away, if you will, because that is so hard to fathom. But what I think is important on this topic, and would love to get your thoughts too, I try to show people that we just talked about that God's just, but he is not fair. What do you think about that statement, real quick?
He's just, but he's not fair. It's like it's a I guess it's like a good catchphrase because it does exemplify that we are not getting the punishment that we deserve because we believe in Jesus. Jesus
Hmm.
didn't deserve to get punished, but he did on our behalf because of love and everything. So I definitely think that it's like a true statement. Um, but I do think that it's like he's just and he's fair. Um, I don't know. I don't know how I really
It,
feel
it,
about
it,
it.
it de- so it depends how you define fair. And that's where I try to get people then define it. And
Mhm,
so what I would say that he's not fair in the sense of our humanness.
mhm,
And so he is like just, and some would say, well, that's the same thing as fair. But in our sense of humanness, we all should live a nice long life and be comfortable. That's like what
Oh, I
our
see what you mean.
ideal of
Okay.
fairness is. You see what I mean? Like it's like this equitable, we get what we deserve. But
Mhm,
his justice is different than our fairness in that
mhm,
sense. And so I, yeah, I can't explain like why specifically he killed that baby in that attack and judgment, but God is just and he'll make all things right. And that goes to also the fact of like First Samuel where it says like babies go to heaven and things like that. And that's a separate topic maybe, but understanding God's justice and the pure evil of that entire generation. And the women were not like innocent either. Like, okay, well, why the women? But they were also okay as a whole, sacrificing babies and eating all this like wickedness. And so to have this idea that even all women and people are innocent unless for like the male warriors or whatever is
right.
is false too. So I again, it's a tough topic, but those are some of the approaches that I would take. um and God does enact justice through people on this earth. So vengeance is his, but he also uses people. And we even look at today's modern day wars. There's times that wars are actually a judgment of God. And I personally believe, and this might be controversial, but like the ISIS and everything going on there, like that was pure evil, beheading people and all that stuff. And they were judged through war, I believe,
Mhm,
and ultimately eternally too. And so God uses the horrible atrocities of wars to judge at times. Not every war is a judgment, sometimes just human nature. But those are some thoughts. How would you answer it? Anything to add or differ on answering the question about the Amalekites?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, like you said, I don't think that the women are innocent in this party, but the children and I've talked to some people who are like vegans who are like, but what about the animals? I don't really, I personally don't care that much about that one, but the baby, like the kids, right? I think that it's horrible to think that these kids are being judged as well, but I do think that the element of, you know, children do go to heaven. Like I think that is a fairly clear in the scriptures that children do go to heaven. But there's also the element I think that people don't really think about is that your life itself, the breath in your lungs is from God. He gives
Yes.
every single thing its breath of life. And by being the giver of life, he also has every right in the world to remove that whenever he wills. I don't I personally have never really struggled with that aspect because he's God, right? And you probably heard your mom say, "I brought you into this world, I can take you out." It's like that's not really true, but I think it is true for God. God, he gives and takes life whenever he wills, and a lot of people I think also kind of think about this, kind of like what you were saying earlier. Like everyone deserves to live a long and healthy life, and I just don't think that that's necessarily true either. But a lot of people, when talking about this, they think like, I would have lived forever if God didn't kill me. That's essentially what they are talking like. They're like, oh, I would have lived forever if God didn't give me a heart attack at 80 years old. Like some people have problems even with God, you know, killing people in their older age. And I'm just like, well, you got to die at some point. I'm not saying that to justify like the killing of babies or something, but we are all destined to die. It is going to happen. like everyone knows this. There is no escaping it, no matter how much these technophiles in Silicon Valley want to avoid it these days. You're going to die. Your flesh will
Yeah.
die. And I don't know. It makes, I think a lot of aspects of this kind of get fleshed out, and
Yeah.
a lot of misunderstandings, especially from like atheists who aren't as familiar with the Bible. It comes out in these conversations because they just don't understand God's character, and they don't believe in our God. So that makes it a little bit difficult as well.
Yeah. And that's so important that it's not even like we're explaining God and their character, but we have to expose their wrong assumptions and wrong worldviews that are fundamentally false outside of even religion or
Yeah.
Christianity. Like this idea of, oh, we're all going to live a nice day unless God intervenes. Like that's fundamentally false based on all the evidence around us. And so
Yeah.
we do have to poke holes while we do answer the question, like we don't avoid it, we have to poke holes that their foundation cannot stand.
Mhm.
And if we compare the foundations of our view versus theirs, that's much more effective than looking at some of the results of our foundation, like this Amalekite situation. And we're not trying to avoid it, so I don't want to like, oh, just don't answer the question because just answer it. But we have to go through and unpack the worldview as well.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question, because
Yeah.
a lot of people, right, they think about the problem of evil, atheists especially, and they just say the world makes a lot more sense just by looking at it, all the evil, all the death. It makes a lot more sense without an all loving God. It just makes more sense that there would be this much evil if God wasn't all loving. They'll say, oh, okay, maybe like a God who has evil in him, that makes sense. You may be able to justify that, but why an all loving God? It doesn't seem to add up. How would you go about answering that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what you really need to even unpack is like what is good and evil in their eyes.
Mm.
Because their definition of good may actually be evil in our view of who God is. And so before I even answer that question directly, which I would eventually, is you have to talk about what is good and evil and then absolute versus relative morality. Because I believe every atheist I've talked to believes in relative morality. And
Definitely,
that
yeah.
that I would say needs, that really is the answer to the question, is you actually don't even know what good and evil is, so it's an invalid question. Or we need to establish what is good and evil, and then I can answer that question. And so in that way I would, in the classic Jesus way, is ask a question of a question: what is good, what is evil? And fundamentally we are on different planets because they believe
Yeah.
in relative morality. And so it's a really not possible to answer unless we define what is good and evil.
Yeah, I definitely think that's really important, because if they just got done arguing, let's say, about like the Amalekites and saying how evil God is for that, well, in the Christian perspective, what he did was not evil. So it's like their
It was good.
definition of evil is already different from ours. And you definitely have to clarify that for sure.
Yeah, and most times with this Amalekite question, I don't get it every day, but especially in Princeton, I would get it a lot.
Oh yeah, I got that in Princeton for sure.
Is once I explained to them who the Amalekites were, and even compared them to maybe some more modern day situation like the Nazis in World War II, it hit a little bit more personal of, oh yeah, I'm really glad that Hitler was taken out and the Nazis were stopped. Okay, so then what's different about the Amalekites? And yes, they might say the women, but there was also women and children that were killed in World War II.
Insane
Like
amounts, actually, like way more than
ex-
people know.
yes, and not even in the concentration camps, but the Germans themselves. And
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
when I put them into a more thing that they can relate, usually they quiet down because they're like, oh yeah, that is actually, I'm glad that Hitler's not ruling the world and that people are being thrown in furnaces. Like, yes, there was casualties in the midst of it, and no one wishes that. uh but it's just the reality of evil, and when good and justice reigns, there's still a product of evil that's happening even when there's justice that is happening in the process.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, the atrocities that happened in World War II, pretty much from every side, because that's just how war goes. Um, you know, we are ultimately kind of like accepting that those things do happen in war, and maybe God didn't specifically command the American forces to kill every child or woman, but those things absolutely did happen. What about this? How about this question? I've heard a lot of apologists, when they try to answer this Amalekite question, they go about using like biblical language and saying like, oh, the total annihilation doesn't mean total annihilation. I mean, what do you think about that? Have you heard that before?
I have, and I've kind of dismissed it in some ways, just because it does say total annihilation, and the danger of that is we're trying to defend God rather than letting God defend himself. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if they were right, maybe, but if God also had them kill the women and children, would you still trust him? And so to me, it's a little bit of a danger zone that I don't use that reasoning. Could it be possible? Yes, but we're trying to wordsmith something that isn't really there. And we're it's just dangerous when we're trying to soften God's wrath and justice, and rather trusting in his goodness in the midst of his wrath. So I would not suggest people to use that, just because it's a little bit in the yellow danger zone.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. So in a video that I did on the problem of evil, I discussed the ways that God can go about ending evil. And I think like the primary way that God prevents evil from happening is to kill people, is to end their lives, because how else is he going to do it? There's only really two options to prevent someone from doing what they want to do. You either remove their will or you remove their life, right? Because I mean, how else are you going to do it? We do it today in our legal system. Someone wants to commit crimes, we put them in prison. We remove their ability, their will to do it. Or sometimes, I mean, we don't really do it anymore, but we sometimes execute people. So it's like the only ways in my mind is to either remove our free will or to kill us. Do you agree with that, or do you think that there's more to it than that?
That's a good question. I was thinking through that. So I think that so would you say removing will, like say putting someone in prison, that's like removing their will?
In a
Or
sense, yeah, I would say so.
okay,
Yeah.
because God can use other humans to uh like put them in justice and to refrain them, but if that's considered removing their will, then yeah, I guess
Hmm.
I would agree, but also leaving it open, because you also look at John 6 and even the Calvinist view of like, can God even draw them to, which I know
Yeah,
we're neither
yeah.
of us are Calvinists, but that's, I would say, to play devil's advocate, that would be the other way, is that God would regenerate them and give them heart surgery, as it says in Ezekiel 36. But in a sense, could you argue that that's removing their will, or that's just like offering them and they have to choose the will? So yeah, I would say it's probably the two ways that he can do it. So yeah, I would agree that that's probably generally the two ways that he can actually do something. He can move other chess pieces to draw them or to enact those two things. But yeah, that's probably correct.
Yeah, because I mean, I thought about that a long time, like way back in the day. I'm like, how could God end evil? And you look at the ways that he does end evil in the Bible, and it usually is a resulting in death. Like you look at the flood, Noah's flood. Every thought of every human heart was evil all the time, continually. Right? That's what the Bible says, something along those lines. And the way that he decided to end that evil is to just start over, essentially, to wipe everyone off the map. And
Yeah.
it's like at a certain point, like people may get angry about that, but then I do think that it comes back around to the other topic I talked about in the video was how people, when thinking about the problem of evil and thinking about why God is allowed to do certain things, and how that doesn't make him evil, is that a lot of the times it does come down to a sense of pride, they think that if they were God, they could run things better. They could run a better ship. They
Yeah.
could order things in a different way. They would do things differently than God, and they would just, I think that that's a humility problem, a pride problem, rather than, I don't know. I don't know how any human mind could even begin to comprehend all of the interlacing things and the interactions between humans to be able to come up with, like, I could do it better than God. It just doesn't make sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely this, how could God allow suffering? There's definitely a pride aspect of, well, I would do it differently and I would do it better. And a lot of times when people, like, even on the streets ask me this, that's actually what we get to, is like, even the Amalekite question, what would you do if kids were being sacrificed, or like, how would you solve this problem? And
Right.
they usually are stumped, 'cause it's like, exactly, it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there's an aspect of, like, almost, yeah, there's a humbleness that is needed in it too. To change the topic a little bit, I don't
Yeah,
want
go
to,
for it. Mm-hmm.
because the origins topic even too is the book of Job. We I think most know it pretty well, the story, but Job chapter 1, it's pretty clear that Satan comes to God and wanted to inflict suffering. What's your view on Satan being the origin of at least some level of the evil and suffering in the world? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of what are called like theonomies, like the trying to justify, how all this can, coexist. And one of the ones that you hear all the time is saying, like, oh, see, God's not the origin of evil. Satan is. Satan's the one who did it. But then it just moves the goalpost one step further and,
Yeah.
like, well, who created Satan? And it's like there is. I mean, is Satan responsible for some of the evil? Yes, he is. Just like we are responsible for some of our evil decisions. But ultimately, it is God who created everything. And by default, if I create something and that thing does evil in some way, I'm responsible in some way as well. I am. Like, it's the same way as me as a father. If my son breaks a window, sure, he did it, but I still have to pay, right? I still have to pay for the window to get fixed. I'm responsible for my offspring. And it's kind of the same way for God. Everything that God makes, he does take responsibility for it in some way. So is Satan the one doing the things to Job? Yes, he is. But who gave him permission? It's God. God had to give him permission to do it. So it's like, I don't know. It's a tough one.
And even, like, as you mentioned before, some might even blame Satan for all suffering, which is moving the responsibility from us, which is also dangerous. And I, I've been talking with this guy. He has a YouTube channel called Curious Christianity, but he actually has a view where Satan, the Isaiah and Ezekiel passage of him falling from the heavens, if you will,
Yeah.
was actually after the fall. He has an interesting view. I don't fully
Interesting.
agree with
Yeah.
it, but it's an interesting one. Genesis 3 unpacks it. But I think it's important that we don't blame everything on Satan, but also acknowledge that Satan does cause suffering, evil, and a lot of things at play. You look at Daniel and the Prince of Persia and
Mm-hmm.
the angels and the demons attacking. And so in this aspect of like, why does God allow suffering in the play of Satan? Yeah, we don't know exactly what was the root issue of Satan, like turning evil, if you will. But we know the humans, and so we can't blame everything on Satan, but we acknowledge that he exists. And so it's an interesting topic. We don't have the full answer, but we know some things, at least, not that we can't just blame everything on Satan.
Yeah. I remember I was watching something. It was a guy who he did his like PhD on the problem of evil, and he went through all of the different arguments and stuff. But his ultimate conclusion, and I think that there's something to this, his ultimate conclusion to answering why evil exists in the world is, I can't remember what he called it, but it was like the story argument. Like, it's in every story of mankind, man overcoming evil, like overcoming trials and tribulations and suffering and coming out on the other side a better and stronger person. It's like the hero's journey, right? Everyone knows these stories. Like, you think of Lord of the Rings with like Frodo. He's like a wimp, but by the end of the story, he's changed. He went through all the hard stuff and he came out the other side. And after all of his study on the problem of evil, he thinks that that is one of the most effective arguments against it, is that it is in us, in our very soul, in our very hearts, to know that suffering, though unpleasant, though terrible, and many would describe it as evil, there is still like a benefit to it in some way. And
Yeah.
I've always kind of been of the mindset of more like the stoicism mindset of just like suffering isn't always bad. Like it's not fun, it's not pleasant, but it's not always bad. It does produce in you maturity. It does produce in you perseverance. It does. Like anyone who
Yeah.
lifts weights knows that. You don't lift weights for fun. You lift weights because they make you stronger. It's the same thing with suffering. The more suffering you go through, the more character you have. We look at these stories of people, and all the people we look up to, like Rocky. You watch the movie Rocky.
Mhm.
Everyone loves Rocky. Horrible, horrible time. He's having the horrible time the whole time, but he comes out as the victor in the end. It's like all of our stories are that way, all of them. So I personally, I resonate with that as someone who doesn't see suffering as evil necessarily, but it does also leave open the question of what about like gratuitous suffering? Like, how does a child getting bone cancer result in him becoming stronger in some way? Like, it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense, but
Yeah, because like
yeah.
we can't always see the good, and also like yeah, we can't even answer it, and it depends on the person's perspective. And this is why whenever someone asks the question of why does God allow suffering, if it's general, I ask them why, or like what makes you question that? Because if they're going through something that's like really unexplainable and hard, like their
Mhm.
kid as 3-year-old has cancer, if I just said, "Oh, but don't worry, God will make all things together for the good of those who seek
Yeah.
Him," like for the Christian, like that's not helpful. And so, uh, even like Paul says, like all things are good, but not all things beneficial, and that applies, I think, to our answering of this question is being aware, putting yourself in their shoes. What would be helpful in this circumstance? If like
Mhm.
someone's going through suffering, and you can see from the outside that they're drawing closer to God, or they're um, trying harder and getting up again. It's like this is going to produce a lot of character. So you can use that, but you have to be just cognizant of the person and how it will impact them.
Totally.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I have never used that argument to anybody in my entire life. But for me personally, it resonates very
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and there might be some people listening that's like, yeah, that's true. So it's like you can use it. You just pick your battles, and we're actually planning to do some like videos and content of even how to share the gospel in hospitals.
Hmm.
Because I think it's important to go through that. And my daughter had like a children's hospital stay for almost a week. She had some disease and stuff. She's okay now, but it's like other kids are not, like, and I was burdened by that stay of like I just want to talk to these people and encourage them and just listen to them and share with them some truths, but it's definitely nuanced when you're going through some heavy duty suffering.
Absolutely. And I,
But
I think that a lot of the elements of what Christianity is the giving hope in the suffering, because I mean, when we talk about the problem of evil, is it's like if we remove God, it doesn't make the evil go away, right? Like the evil's still there. You're still suffering. Like, and it's not pleasant for nobody wants to do it. But the removal of God is like there's no answer now. There's no reason for it
yes.
anymore. But if you are a Christian, atheists will probably just say like, "Oh, you're just coping or something." But if it's true, if it's true, then it's not coping. But the Christianity at least has an answer for what is the outcome of all of this. Atheism obviously has none. Many other religions may have their answers as well, but I don't think that the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, goes away by the removal of God. It may go away in the Christian sense, but the suffering is still there. The evil is still there.
Yes, and there's no solution in any of those religions, and especially atheism, because let humans do what they want. It's certainly not better.
Yeah.
And you could argue religion has caused a lot of atrocities, of course, but if you go back to the nature of God and even the Bible, if people actually follow the word of God, like the Bible, there's not going to be doing like the crazy things that religion has done in the name of God. And so separating what humans have done in the name of God and who God is so important in this topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is always the element. I mean, this is usually where I go. If I'm talking to like an atheist, is I ask them, I'm like, who are you to call something evil in your worldview, right?
Mm.
Like, if you are truly an atheist, if you are truly a moral relativist, right? There is no real. I mean, let's be honest. There really is no such thing as evil. There's no such thing. You may not like it. It's a personal preference of yours. I don't. If I was also an atheist, I wouldn't care about your opinion, right? That's like the whole idea of atheism. And you have a lot of modern day atheists trying to come up with some kind of moral framework, but I just think that they're all vapid, honestly. I mean, yeah, I do wonder where they get off calling anything evil, because it's like you have no grounds for calling it anything good or evil, because neither exists, honestly. So,
Yeah. And the sign too, but we have like this sign, what percentage of people are good. And the reason I love it is because agnostics and atheists and relativists, before we even get to God and the gospel and Jesus, is we talk about absolute truth versus relative truth, and absolute
yeah,
morality and relative morality. And I don't think that you can share the gospel effectively unless you establish that there is absolute truth and absolute standard of morality, because then the message that we have is just nice message. And so you do have to lay a framework, because if there's no agreement there, then really the gospel has no power. And that people might stone me for that, but
yeah, yeah.
because they're just going to be like, it has no um it's nice for you but not for me. And
Mhm.
yes, God can use the gospel and he can unblind their eyes, and so all that is true. Like, let's just get to the gospel. But laying that groundwork and poking the holes in the worldview of those relativists is important and helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I was recently working on some Friedrich Nietzsche stuff, and I have a really hard time reading his works, to be honest. They're morally reprehensible to me. Like, I have visceral reactions sometimes reading it. But what I at least respect at a very great level with him is he is so honest about where his worldview winds up, and where the atheistic worldview, if God is dead, this is true. And I really respect him for it, because I really think that modern day atheists are kind of cowards in this way, where they kind of run away from the reality of, if there is no God who is the originator of absolute morality, anything goes. Like, I read Antichrist by him recently, and he says in it, he's like, yeah, we should essentially kill the pathetic people. We should kill them all, because they are a burden. He says, like, empathy, is it empathy or compassion, is a moral evil in his eyes, because it doesn't benefit him, right? And I'm just like, thank you for being honest. Like, at least you are being honest. I'm so sick of these guys today, like Sam Harris, if you know who that is.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, oh my gosh, makes me want to put a bullet in my brain, because I'm like, you have no grounds to say anything you're saying right now. You, like, who are you
Yeah.
to talk about morality? You don't believe in God. And yeah, so I respect Nietzsche for that.
Yeah, it's really yeah, there is no foundation, and a lot of times just asking questions exposes them.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, and the, I actually talked to some agnostics and atheists, like, and after just asking questions, they're like, I really don't know why I think this. And I have to almost explain to them, based on your worldview, this is what you have to believe.
Mhm.
And they're usually like, yeah, you're probably right. And I think what has happened is that most people, not all, but a large majority, I think, of atheists and even agnostics, they haven't really thought through their worldview.
Mhm.
They just don't like God, or they don't like the people that name themselves Christians or whatever.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
therefore they go to the other title. And so that's where, like, even this topic of suffering has produced, especially today, because maybe 15 years ago people were a little more thought provoking when they're calling themselves atheists, a little bit, but
You're being
but
generous, Kevin.
yeah, a little bit generous, but that's okay. But it's a lot of times they're just angry at the idea of God, and so they just don't want to be associated. And a lot of times I try to get people to just acknowledge you're not an atheist. You're not actually an agnostic. You just don't want God to exist.
Hmm.
And you'd be surprised. So many people are like, yeah, that's correct. And I was like, if we leave now, I'm happy because at least you know the root of the problem.
Yeah.
It's not this moral intellectualism that you're confused with or like can't understand God. You just don't like God and his nature and his ways. And
Hmm.
God can deal with him from there.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said earlier, it comes back to pride. It always does. It's like
Yes.
I always call it like the quote unquote original sin because it is like the beginning sin of like everything. Everything stems from it, even back to Satan himself. So
And realistically, even you can't become a Christian without laying down at least a portion of your pride because you
totally,
have
yeah.
to acknowledge yourself and your sin and that you need a savior. And so, yeah, exposing the pride in this question. And it's hard because if someone comes like, why would my grandma die of cancer? Like we don't like reprimand them like you're a prideful person. Like,
Yeah, definitely not. Yeah.
but at the end of the conversation, if you walk through it with them, if you empathize with them, if you ask questions of their worldview, 15 minutes later, I've gotten to where it started from a grandma with cancer, and the end is you need to repent of your pride, and they're not angry at you, and so that's why like just going slowly through this conversation about God allowing suffering, why, and all that is important. And you'd be surprised, you can get to some crazy places pretty quickly if you just listen and work through it with them, think through it with them.
Hmm.
Because, like you said, it's pride.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects of this problem that we could go into. I mean, where do you want to go next, Kevin? What are you thinking?
So, yeah. So, I guess from a how would you differ in a response to a Christian versus a clearly non-Christian? What would you say are some of the principles that you would differ on knowing their background?
Yeah, I mean, for Christians, I often find that I think that they lack an understanding of who God is in the same way that atheists do a lot of the times. Like I remember talking to one Christian who would not he could not agree with me that God causes like earthquakes and thunderstorms. And I was like, there is a verse in Isaiah that literally says that. Literally, like, I mean, it's clear as day. It is not up for dispute at all. And if you can't accept that, well, that's something with your faith. But for an atheist, you kind of have to do all the framework stuff that we talked about earlier of talking about like, well, who is God and what is evil and all those things. Those are the kind of the approach that I would go. But if I'm talking to a Christian who's struggling with the problem of evil, I mean, I feel like it kind of comes down to one, making sure they have a right view of God, but two, helping them to see who God is because they already believe in Christ. I always point them to Christ. I'm like, what did Christ do to solve the problem of evil? And this is where all the conversation should end up ultimately. But Jesus is doing everything in his power, literally, to end evil. Like he's doing all of the carrying here. He's doing all of the work to end the evil. And it may be taking longer than you'd like, but the Bible tells us that God is taking a while because he wants us to repent and come to him, right? He's patient with us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to a knowledge of him, right? So if that's true, well, it's like you may not like his time frame. You may think that he's being slack in his judgment, but, he's not slow in the way that some count slowness. That's what the Bible says, So there's a lot of things to be thinking about for sure.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, all those things are good, but like to a Christian, almost redefining what the Christian life is. One, we're following Jesus, and Jesus says like we will also suffer, that all who seek to live a godly life will be persecuted. Jesus
Yeah.
called people and told them, you will suffer for my name's sake. And also there's going to be diseases and stuff like everyone else does too. So following Christ, there will be more suffering in the short term than if you weren't a Christian at
Mm-hmm.
some level. And so this has stemmed from the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel that is obvious, like the Joel Osteens of the world, but also it's infiltrated the general evangelical church in America of that, like, it's going to be easy, and this like escapism of God won't let us suffer in the end times. It's like, no,
Yeah.
like this
Yeah.
idea is so wrong and the opposite of what Jesus said. So it depends where the person is. I'm not going to probably like lead with that. Like, I'd probably understand what their view is, but I think that is an area that you have to do. And there, to a Christian, I would more quickly say, remind them of the scripture that like character, like it produces character, produces perseverance. Um, but I think it depends on, because everyone is either in a trial, preparing for a trial, or coming off a trial. I know it's famously said probably in better words, but it depends on which part. If they're in the middle of a trial, I probably won't be like, it's gonna produce good character.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Definitely.
if they're coming off of one, I've asked Christians and the ones that I've mentored, like, how have you grown spiritually in this last year when I knew the year was a pretty rough one? They're like, wow, like I've been praying a lot more. And I don't like try to stick to them. I'm so glad you suffered then, but like trying to help them to realize, oh wow, God is doing something good in me. I won't say it while they're in the hospital like dying, but if they come out of it, there's wisdom in that, because it's scripture that it does produce suffering. And James chapter 1 is a classic one that it goes even so far, and maybe you can give thoughts too, of if you are not growing, if you're not like being challenged, it says to even ask for
Yeah.
trials. And
Yeah.
so it's like, that's so countercultural and, to be honest, crazy. Like, why would I ask for trials? But the goal in life of Christianity is not comfort. The goal in life in Christianity is to know Christ, and he naturally does that through trials.
Yeah. I mean, I love the book of James for that reason. Because like I said earlier, I think that suffering is good in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
whether we like it or not. I think it is good. Um, so yeah, the count it, consider it pure joy, my brethren, when you encounter trials of various kinds. And then he goes on to say, like, if any of you lacks wisdom, ask God. And he's talking about it in the context of trials
Yes.
make you wise, which they do. I mean, ask anyone, how do you become wise? It's not by sitting around reading books. It's about going out and facing trials and overcoming them. That's how you become wise. That's why the Bible like respects like old people, saying like they're wise by default. Now, that might not be as true today because life is so much easier for people, but in the past, So I don't know. I personally don't struggle with like certain suffering in the way that other people do. Just by personality, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing to point out too, especially to the Christian in suffering, that not all suffering leads to endurance, character, and perseverance, all those things. It's what you do in that suffering. And I wanted
Totally.
to
Yeah.
specify that because I think sometimes suffering for a Christian causes them to doubt their faith or even leave the faith.
Hmm.
And so it only produces suffering if we trust God in the process. And
Hmm.
that's really hard. It's easier said than done. Is there going to be doubt? Absolutely. But I think, unfortunately, with Christians, we throw that around too liberally in the sense of all suffering will be good for us.
Hmm.
It's only how we respond to it. And even like, and want to get your thoughts on this. Job obviously suffered. We talked about it. He lost his entire family,
Yeah.
all his wealth, the disease, everything like that. Would you say that God rebuked Job? What would your response be to that?
Yeah. So I did a whole video on Job because it's one of my favorite books. Yeah. Did God rebuke Job? Yes, he did. Like, absolutely, bar none. I mean, how many questions does he ask Job? It's at least 50, right? He asks some question
In
after
a row.
question. Yeah, like, doesn't even. Anytime Job has an opportunity to speak, Job's just like, I need to shut my mouth. I can't say anything, right? Because it's like, yeah, Job, I mean, let's be honest. Job had lots of questions about why he was going through the suffering. Like, it's not like he went through the whole thing just like Mr. Stoic, sitting there like, this is good for me. Like, it wasn't like that
Yeah.
at all. Like, he was going through lots of struggles, lost a lot of things, a lot of family, everything, right? And the whole time he is questioning God, But the key verse that you see over and over again is that Job did not accuse God of evil. And that's
Yes.
the
Yeah.
most, I mean, that's the only thing that is preventing what he's doing from being sin. He is not accusing God of evil. But he does at the same time have some misunderstanding. Like he doesn't have a perfect, like a right view of God. And I mean, who does, right? He doesn't have a perfectly right view of God. So when God comes in, he's like, look, you want to present your cause to me. It's like, you want to question me why I'm doing things. He's like, Job, where were you when I did X,
Yeah.
Y, and Z 50 times over? Like, where were you? And it is a bit of a rebuke, but it's like, it's not like a rebuke like the Friends get. Like the Friends, they get a rebuke, like almost like a judgment rebuke. Job is getting more of like what I would call like a God spanking. Like it's like, you know, you need to shape up a little bit here. You know, you're throwing a little bit of a temper tantrum. It's not like a sin necessarily, but you're not seeing things clearly. So God comes
Yeah.
in and he reshapes his worldview. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's good because it depends how you define a rebuke, but it was certainly different than his friends. 'Cause
Oh yeah,
they
they got it
maybe got
bad.
like a
Yeah.
judgment, like basically this is terrible and sin. I almost equate it to, in a way, the passage where Peter walks on the water
Hmm.
and he's looking at Jesus, and then as soon as he takes off his eyes off of Jesus and the waves, the problems of the world,
Yep.
Jesus rebuked him, and it says the word rebuke.
Hmm.
And why did you doubt me?
Yeah.
And even before the rebuke, he saved him. So by God's grace, that's I'm glad he did that rather than
Yeah.
repent or else not. But
Yeah.
I almost view it of that is that in Christianity, as a Christian, when we suffer, we will have wrong views. Just because we're human nature, we're gonna put our eyes on the problems rather than God. No one
Hmm.
suffers perfectly, but how does God respond to it? There is a level of rebuke, but it's not out of judgment of basically like, how dare you? Like it's redirect. Change your eyes off the problems and put your eyes on me. And there's a lot of Christians though that has this view that we are the Job's friends in the sense of,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, God's never going to forgive me for doubting him when I was in the hospital with cancer. And we have to be gentle in those circumstances because I even just was talking to someone recently who had this view of like God's rebuking me because I have doubt. Yes, there's a rebuke, but it's a different rebuke than the friends. It's
Yeah.
look at me instead of your problems. And so that's an important part in Christianity and the suffering is separating those two types of rebukes.
Yeah, yeah, that's I think the big thing when I was saying like God shifts his perspective. It's like you
Yeah.
were saying like Peter's perspective should have been looking at Christ, but his perspective switches when he turns his head, right? And I really love that. I mean, that's one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible, Peter
Yeah.
walking on the water. Because, I mean, Jesus says to him, like, ye of little faith. It's like, the dude was just walking on water. Right? He had enough
He had
faith.
more faith than everyone else.
Yeah, he had enough faith to get out of the boat, walk on the water. If he has a little faith, I've got like no faith, right? That's how I feel.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's definitely it's really important for Christians, you know, to do what God does to Job, you know, and to fix the perspective, to re-look at God, look at who God is. Like that's all of what God is saying to Job is like, look at who I am. And you think that you're going to question me? It's like, I really think that that is really important. And I mean, God doesn't give Job even an answer at all about why he allowed all the suffering. He doesn't even begin to answer. And I think that he does it on purpose because if faith is like the thing in Christianity, right? It's like the key ingredient to everything. Nothing is effective. Everything is sin apart from faith. Right? So if faith is the thing that we need, it's like God can't give us all the answers because, like I said earlier, we wouldn't understand it anyway if he did. But faith is the key ingredient. And you don't have faith. If you have all the answers, there's no faith left. It's not
Yeah.
possible. You need to have some element of doubt to have faith. You need to have some element of not knowing to have faith. It's just
Mhm.
inherent in the word faith. You have to have both. Yeah.
Yeah. And even on that faith thing too, that again separates from Christianity, like the word pistis, like there is an aspect of it's faith based on evidence. Because there's a lot of people, like atheists, believe that Christians believe based on blind faith. And
Oh yeah, yeah.
that's the connotation of faith is not that. Yes, there's a faith of like, I can't physically see it, but what Jesus did, again, going back to it, is we have faith in God and his nature and his character because Jesus showed it to us. And yes, I
Yeah.
wasn't there in 2000 years, but the evidence for Jesus, that's a whole nother topic, is
Yeah,
everywhere.
yeah, right.
It's like,
Hmm.
I'm not blindly believing faith. And it's not just because I felt something or it's an emotional crutch. Like there is massive amounts of evidence of why we can have evidence, not only in God's existence, but in his nature, his nature of kindness and goodness and
Yeah.
justice and holiness and all these things. And really this question comes down to is, what do you do with God? Because God
Hmm.
is who he is. We're not here to defend him or explain away things he's done.
Yeah.
We're presenting God, and then it's to your point, do you trust him?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher. If you know my
Yeah.
YouTube channel, you know that, right? I
Yeah.
love him, and I think that after reading him, I didn't know what faith was like definition wise until I read him. I really think that he just nails it on the head. You know, talking about Abraham, it's not like God just woke him up one day without any interaction with him ever and just said, "Hey, kill your son." It's not that simple. There's so much experience that was through the past, promises of God that came true. The Isaac existing in the first place is a promise of God. God promising that all nations would be blessed through him. So Abraham has a lot of experience to go off of that builds his faith over time before he gets to the ultimate test. And I think that that's how God works with us even today. It's like there's so many promises in God's word that you can like test God on, if you want to say it that way. God even tells the Israelites at one point, test me on this, start keeping my Sabbaths and see that I will bless you, right? And in a way, God does want us to test his promises, not in like the putting God to the test, but like see that what I'm saying is true. And then if you can see that these lesser, smaller promises are true, then you'll be able to trust me on the bigger ones that I'm not going to give you an answer on. I think that that's kind of where this all comes from. When we can start to understand God's goodness, that when we ask for bread, he's not going to give us a stone. When we ask for good things, he's not going to give us bad things necessarily. So, and I think that one of the aspects of going back to the book of James, you know, when we ask for um, blessings, when we ask for good things, he's, you know, he says, every good and perfect gift is from
Yep.
above, right? Coming down from our Father of heavenly lights. But some of the things that we get from God don't feel like gifts in the same way that we want wisdom, but we don't like the way that wisdom comes about. It's like sometimes the things that we get from God don't feel like they're good for us in the moment, but later on we see that they are. You know, Hebrews, is it Hebrews 12 that talks about God's discipline? It's like no discipline is
Yep.
pleasant at the time, but afterwards we respect our Father in heaven for it. Afterwards we see the fruit of it. And, you know, man, there's so many things that you could talk about in this. That's like the thing. You could jump around the whole Bible over this issue. You
Yeah.
really could. So,
Yeah. And I've never even studied, but I feel like probably almost every book of the Bible has some level of suffering, judgment, like
totally.
something
Yeah.
there. So it's
Yeah.
like it is everywhere. I did have one question, wanted to get your thoughts because there's different views, especially this is more for the Christian space of like how God like only brings trials to the best people type thing, or this like
Yeah.
what's your thoughts on that like view? Because it's interesting.
Yeah. The meme, like, God only gives his strongest battles to his strongest soldiers or whatever. Yeah,
Yes,
that one.
yeah,
um, it's like, in a way, it's true. In a way, right? I think that is kind of true. I mean, Abraham is the father of faith, and I think that he had the greatest trial up until Christ, right? I think that Christ ultimately had like the greatest test of faith, if you can even call it that, because I mean he's God. But um, yeah, I do think that in a sense it's true, But also, I do feel like even people with very little faith also go through very hard times sometimes. So
Yes.
it's really hard to say.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, I really hate the saying, but there is some truth to it.
Yeah.
Like, and like you even look at Job, like Satan went to and say, "Can I do inflict this?" And God gave him Job because he said he is the most faithful one, and God knew that he could handle this
Yeah.
great test, if you will. But I think that what the problem with the saying goes is it belittles other people and it like just cause people, well, I don't want to be very faithful if that causes more trials. Like,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
I think it's a dangerous saying, but there's some truth to it, but it's interesting.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good question. I've never like thought through it super hard, but at the same time, I do think there's some truth to it for sure. Yeah. I don't know. Anything else you want to cover? It's been
I'm
a
trying to
while.
think
I'm
of,
trying to think.
oh man, I'm trying to think. There's definitely so many others. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
I mean, like I said, this can go so many different directions, but typically what I hear from atheists is that they, I mean, I go back to the one story of the conversation I had with that one atheist who early in the conversation was bashing God for the Amalekites. Like he could not get behind God killing the Amalekites. And but then later on, he was mad at God for not ending evil in the world, and later on in the conversation. And I was like, look, like, this is where I started thinking about this thing of like God either has to kill you or whatever. And I was like, how else could he have ended the evil? How else? And this always kind of comes back to the crux of it for the atheist is they think that there's this magical solution to evil where you can just like snap your finger and it all goes away. And it's like, maybe, but probably not. I mean, if there was a magic solution, a magic bullet to just get rid of all of it immediately without infringing too much on the will of man in some way, I think God would have done it. But I think that God is demonstrating his love in all of it anyway. Like the demonstration of God's love is that he is patient with us. The demonstration of God's love is that he is long suffering with us. That he all of the evil that we are doing is causing God suffering as well, and yet he is
Yeah.
allowing it. He's doing everything in his power to stop it without too much infringement on all these things. But I don't know. It's really difficult to kind of work through these things. But
Yeah, and even if it goes deeper after the Amalekites, like I heard it towards their own personal life,
yeah,
and hopefully by then we'll already establish good and bad, good and evil, and the standards. And even if they don't disagree, I would make the argument according to God's standard, you like we also should be killed and thrown with a thunderbolt like into hell.
yeah,
And I make it more personal because when people are truly asking this question in a philosophical way, you almost have to point them to the personal aspect as well.
mm-hmm.
Because philosophically, there isn't a perfect answer that they will ever enjoy. But
Right.
if we make it personal, that sometimes convicts them. And using scripture, I mean, the Spirit does it as well. Um, sorry.
No, you're good.
Just got a call. And so that's I think important is bringing it back to them personally. And then Second Peter 3, and I even give them the example of like, look, I was doing a lot of evil in my life
Mm-hmm.
before I got saved. If God came back or ended evil at that time and like restored all things to himself, I would be in a lot of trouble. And so I'm very thankful that God has rescinded or delayed or has been patient, is probably the best way,
Yeah,
with
yeah.
our evil and suffering, because I would be judged and thrown in hell if that were to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I guess going to the next step of the process of this restoration piece, you mentioned of how God can either kill or change the will. I would say maybe now that I'm thinking about it, maybe there's a third option is that he just comes back and comes back. Would you put that under the product or under the umbrella of killing
Yeah.
or changing will? Okay. But
Yeah.
what about the Christians? What about the Christians that are still evil by nature? They are going to be in heaven with him. How would you explain that aspect?
Are you saying like how how could God not judge them as well? Is that what you mean? Or
No, like, so I am saved, but I also am still have evil flesh in me.
yeah.
I don't, depends on when Jesus comes back and when I die or whatever. Like, I'm not going to be thrown in hell or judged. So,
Mhm.
how does he take the evil out of me?
Oh, I think that that's answered pretty easily. Like the sinful flesh is done away with. Like if let's say Jesus came back and let's say
Okay.
that there is a rapture. Let's just say, um, all of the flesh, the sinful flesh, is done away with, and we're given new glorified bodies. And atheists will sometimes ask like, well, is there a free will in heaven? And I'm like, well, there is a will in heaven, similar to how there is a will on earth, but the how free, I you
Yeah,
know
that's
I don't
debatable.
know. Yeah, like were Adam and Eve good in the Garden of Eden? Were they sinless? Yes, they were. But they still had a will, and they still were able to use that will to choose evil. So can we choose evil in some way in heaven? Maybe. Satan did. So I don't know.
Yeah,
Question.
and that's the other thing. Is there ever a possibility of evil in heaven? Like scripture says, like there will be no more disease, crying, all those things. And so I just trust the scriptures and trust
Yeah.
God that there will be none. But it is interesting the fact that Satan did something.
Yeah.
Uh it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it seems like the moment that he did it, he was cast out for doing it. So, like, whatever, I don't know. Maybe it can't exist in heaven, but maybe there's like an alternate place, like hell. You just go instantly. I don't know.
Yeah.
I do think that there's an element of like being in the presence of God just like naturally cleanses the any semblance of sin in us. Like what other desire could you have in the presence of God? Like you would not desire to do evil in the presence of God because you have literally everything you could ever need in Him. I mean, that's what we're called to do now as Christians is like find everything in Him. So
Yeah. And we have like and to your point, I think that makes sense of like my flesh will be killed because we have new bodies, and
yeah,
my soul that is secured and saved in him, like that is still there, but we'll have new bodies. So there is not only no suffering, but there's also no more evil. Because and it's so hard to fathom, and I think that's the hardest part when we're talking about restoration in Christ is you have to have faith and you have to trust something that is has never been experienced by mankind, because
mm-hmm.
all we know is suffering. And so this idea of that there is no suffering at a certain point in time is really, I understand why people struggle with that, because it's like I don't even know what life would be like without suffering. And so having some empathy of like this is hard, but also clinging to the promises of God, even though we don't
Yeah.
fully understand it.
You just reminded me of something, so maybe we can talk about this briefly, or maybe we could save it for another conversation. But
Yeah.
when we do end up talking about this, the problem of all the evil in the world, is I do think that what happens a lot of the times is we overly focus on the evil and we don't look at how much good is also in the world. I do think that there's so
Yeah.
much beauty. I think that there's so much blessing and so much of God's goodness in the world, even in its fallen state. Like there are beautiful things that happen, and even like use childbirth for example. We look at childbirth, tons of suffering, right? Horrible, but the end result is blessing. The end result is life
Mm.
being brought into the world. Like it's a beautiful thing amidst the suffering. It's like almost beauty and destruction in a lot of ways. Like there is so much good still in the world, and God is holding back so much of the evil. Like it says that in one of the Thessalonians, like there is an angel holding back evil currently, and
Yeah.
so it's like God is doing a lot even today amidst all of the suffering, and you go stare at a waterfall next to a sunset for a few minutes. You'll see there's some beauty in the world still. Like it's not like it's all suffering. There is a lot, but even amidst it, there's still so much beauty. And I don't want the focus to be so much on the evil. I do think that we need to change our perspective in a lot of ways and see the good in it as well. So
Yeah, that's a great point. And talking from an optimist perspective, because I'm very optimistic, like it is important to remember that. And we don't realize the half of what we are protected from, just even in our daily lives. Like,
Yeah.
even me going overseas into some countries, like, I didn't get really sick. And it's like,
Hmm.
think of all, like, who knows? Was an angel protecting me? I don't know. Like,
Hmm.
we don't realize how much God is doing. And it's, yes, there's evil, but it could be so much worse. And it just even reminds, like, during the tribulation and the end times, there's talk about like God removing his spirit and putting, like, throwing the judgment. It's like it could be, and it will get a lot worse. And so and just even remembering how God is using suffering for good at times, even. And
Yeah.
like, man, what a gracious God that we have. That, yes, he's just and holy, and yes, there are things that he has to do to create justice and vengeance and discipline. But man, he is so good in the same breath. And even you look at Israel, like, he literally brought them into captivity for their good, which at
Hmm.
the time no one believed or thought that. But
Hmm.
he's doing that still today, of like, he is not only protecting us from things that we don't realize, but he has the long game in mind. He
Hmm.
has a different purpose than us. Our purpose in America oftentimes is comfort, and
Hmm.
his purpose is to know him and to trust him. And so yeah, looking at the good, looking at God's perspective rather than ours, is so critical and hard.
Hmm.
Easier said than done, but it's so critical.
Yeah, I was just evangelizing recently with a guy. His name is Fuzz. That's what they call him. And a woman came up and was asking, like, I have trouble believing in God because God gave me a mental illness that has
Mm.
hindered me in a lot of ways in my life. And he gave a pretty good analogy for like how we may not understand the suffering at the time of this, woman. Her name's Corey Ten Boom. You'd probably heard of him, but
Yeah.
Corey Ten Boom was a Christian who was actually put into a concentration camp. And for, I guess she was, I don't know her whole story, but I think she was harboring Jews, and then she got thrown into a concentration camp for it. And while she was there was a huge issue with lice. Like, lice were giving everyone typhus in these concentration camps, and she kept praying to God and saying, God, remove the lice from us. Like, they're causing so much suffering for us while we're in here. It's horrible. I can't, like, we can't keep going like this. Everyone's getting typhus and dying and things like that. And
Mm.
it wasn't until God never took the lice away. They had the lice the entire time they were in there, but it wasn't until after they were released from the camps that they learned that a lot of the guards were not sexually assaulting the women because they had these lice and they didn't want to get the lice from the women. So it's like, what you had to suffer in this way by getting the lice and not understanding why God wouldn't remove them, but you didn't understand that God was really using the lice as a protection for you, and as something to prevent a greater evil from occurring to you. And I do think that in some ways that puts things into perspective, right? We may not understand why God gave us a mental illness. We may not understand why God gave us some cancer or something like that, but we just have to trust anyway. And a lot of people don't like that answer, but um, I mean, it's what we have to do, right? So
Yeah, and I even say, like, look, if we understood everything about God, we would be God ourselves.
yeah.
Like, we would, and so many times, I don't know if it's good or bad, but in the last few months, like, so many times at the end of conversations, whether it's about suffering or not, I just say, look, basically, you're being your own God, and that's who you actually believe in. And most of them acknowledge, yeah, that's true. And
Hmm.
again, I kind of let them go at that, because now they know that they are trying to be their own God. They want to understand every single thing, and they have to have answers for everything.
Hmm.
But at some level, then you want to be God. And
Yeah.
we know how that works out when people try to be God, is
Hmm.
Satan and stuff. And so, um, again, you don't lead with that question, but or lead with that statement, but if you bring
Yeah.
it to them, there has been a lot of people. I remember this one guy, he was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. And he
Hmm.
was like, not wanting to be his own God, but that
Hmm.
he was showing that mindset. And I really believe there was like a repentance in him, of like, oh my gosh, I can see this is wrong. He didn't
Hmm.
all of a sudden believe in Jesus, but it got them thinking. And that's where a lot of this suffering is. And it's going back again, is they want answers that are not for them and not for any human, and they don't want to trust God because they don't want God to exist.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a good place to
Yeah.
pause this discussion. You know, we could definitely go on for probably another like 3 hours or something, I'm sure.
Probably.
But I think this is a good place to end, and then we can possibly revisit this with a part two at some point.
Yeah, I would love it. And maybe even if people want to comment like questions or topics that we didn't cover, and I'm sure we'll think of others too. So
Totally.
glad to
Yeah.
be on again if you want.
Yeah. So tell the people where to find you so that they can
Yeah,
follow you over there.
for sure. Yeah. So we're on YouTube, Permeate Evangelism, all one word, no spaces. Probably be linked below as well. We're on X, Facebook, and Instagram too, Permeate Evangelism, if you just type that in. And again, we're creating culture of evangelism within the church, but we're also helping the people to answer some of these common questions that we get so that we can answer in a truthful and loving way, and really just be a blessing to people and point people to Jesus. So, yeah, reach out to us, and glad to connect with you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Kevin. I'm sure we'll be in talks in the future.
For sure. Looking forward to it.
All right. God bless everyone.
All
Thanks
right.
for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. You know the deal. See you later.